Amenirdis. You've probably never heard of her. She ruled over the ancient Egyptian city of Thebes. She held one of the highest titles a woman of her time could wield. Yet, if you thought that this enigmatic figure comes from ancient Egypt, you'd be wrong. Amenirdis comes from a period in history when native Egyptians had been conquered by their enemies to the south, the Nubians.
Egypt was vulnerable. It was probably at its weakest point in all history.
How did a woman born from a Nubian king come to rule one of the most important Egyptian cities? Did her father rarely use her to conquer Egypt?
The adoption of a Nubian princess, Amunirdis, as God's wife of Amun, in many ways legitimized Nubian rule in Thebes.
This is the temple for Amenirdis.
I like to think about Amenirdis in this way, as a woman, as someone who has a sense of devotion to the gods and goddesses.
Come with me, Curtis Ryan Woodside, as I investigate the life and death of the god's wife of Amun, Amenirdis, a Nubian princess. As we uncover the 25th Dynasty of Egypt, when the Nubians ruled. The year was 1077 BC. A pharaoh has died. The death of Ramses XI would trigger a set of events that would forever change Egypt. During his reign, Egypt was suffering from internal conflicts. The priests of Amun had taken up much power in the ancient city of Thebes, or Auset, as it was referred to then. The royal tombs were being looted of all their treasures by the suffering population. Yet these sacrilegious acts were also being sanctioned by some priests and high-powered noblemen. The priests wanted to become the absolute power of Egypt, eventually forcing Ramses XI out of Thebes and leaving him to rule from the north in Tanis, while High Priest Herihor took up control of Thebes all the way down to the border with Nubia. The country was divided between north and south. Herihor placed his name within a royal cartouche and took on the ruling titles. For many years, the actual royal pharaohs only ruled from the north in Tanis. They too were overthrown by the Libyans to the west, who had slowly been gaining their own power within Egypt. For millennia, Egypt had been the target of attacks from all their neighboring countries. Great pharaohs like Thutmose III and Ramses were able to keep these invaders at bay, while also expanding Egypt's empire from now Sudan to Turkey. Yet this age of glory had faded by the time of the Libyan pharaohs in 943 BC. Around this time, Libyan pharaoh Shoshank was ruling from Tanis in Egypt and trying to maintain civil relations with the ruling priests in Thebes who were still native Egyptians. Deep down in Nubia in 750 BC, a young girl was born. She was the daughter of the Kushite king Kushite. This young princess was named Amenirdis. She was destined for great things.
The Nubians were very much Egyptianized by this time. Because they had been ruled by Egypt for so long, they had already adopted many Egyptian practices, language, and religion.
A sacred mountain in Nubia, now named Jebel Barkal, was one of the most important sites in Egypt and Nubia. This was the second most important site where the god of the gods, Amun, was worshipped, apart from Karnak Temple in Thebes. Amunirdis means the gift of the god Amun. By Kashta naming his daughter this, he had plans to use his daughter to conquer Egypt, by using something Egypt cherished more than anything else, their religion. In 755 BC, Kashta went peacefully into Upper Egypt and went to Thebes. There, he met with the newly appointed god's wife of Amun, named Shepenupet. He convinced Shepenupet to adopt his daughter Amunirdis, as she was seen as divine. She was the gift from Amun after all, and this could not go unnoticed by Shepenupet. This move of placing Amunirdis as the next in line to be the god's wife was now seen as a sign from the gods that the Nubians had the right to invade Egypt. By 744 BC, the Nubian king Kashta had taken his Amun-given right via his daughter and conquered the southern states of Egypt. He placed his name alongside his daughter's in a cartouche, which was reserved only for royals. He became the first Nubian pharaoh of Egypt. However, the north was still in their sights, yet they needed careful planning. Kashta had then died. His son and the brother of Amunirdis, named Pianki, succeeded and became the next Nubian pharaoh. An Egyptian prince from the Sais region in the Delta did manage to take control of ancient Memphis, invading with his 8,000 Egyptian soldiers around 730 BC. But Egypt was still divided between the separate ruling states.
All of this fighting within Egypt had left them exposed.
For 1,000 years, the Egyptians' enemies to the south, the Nubians, had been constantly fighting against Egyptian rule in their homeland. The Egyptians had conquered them several times, using them for their vast amounts of natural resources, gold, incense, and more. So much so that the Nubians even had their own god of trading.
What archaeology tells us is that there was a lot of cultural exchange between Nubians and Egyptians. The Kushite kings of the 25th Dynasty restored political stability and ended civil unrest in Egypt. Not only that, but they built and restored a lot of Egyptian monuments.
Up in the hills in Luxor, beneath these now abandoned homes, are tombs for nobles from ancient Egypt. This tomb from around 3,400 years ago is for a man called Amenhotep Hoi. This Egyptian man was the Viceroy of Kush, a title that meant that he controlled the tax and trade coming in from Nubia into Egypt. We can see the Kushites, the Nubians from the south, coming into Egypt, bringing offerings and gold. Here is a Nubian princess with a parasol above her chariot, the chariot being pulled by these cows. We can see the Nubians arriving in Egypt. They are arriving with all of their offerings, arriving before Amenhotep Hoi, the man counting all the offerings, and this being presented by Amenhotep Hoi to
Tutankhamun, over here. This is a different side to Tutankhamun that we don't usually get to see.
For millennia, Nubia bowed to Egypt. However, their time was about to arrive. With Egypt left exposed, the Nubians, and especially the Kushite king, saw their opportunity and seized it.
Egypt was vulnerable. It was probably at its weakest point in all history.
Tired of being under the thumb of the Egyptian pharaohs, in 721 BC, the Nubians took the opportunity. Pianki launched a campaign to the north of Thebes and conquered Memphis, becoming the ruler of Upper and Lower Egypt, and the king of Kush. Pianki commissioned a stela to be erected, describing his victory over Egypt. He had this stela placed at Jebel Barkal to prove to all that he ruled from northern Egypt to the extremes of Nubia. He is quoted on the stela as saying, "Hear all what I have accomplished by exceeding my ancestors. I am the Pharaoh, the representation of the gods, the living image of Atum, the god issued from the womb, named as the ruler that is feared by those greater than himself, the one whose father knew all, and whose mother perceived even in the conception that he would be the ruler, the great god, beloved of the gods, the son of Ra, who acts with both arms, Pianki, beloved of Amun." Apart from this very elaborate inscription claiming his rule, he is also shown being supported by the god Amun and his wife Mut, while the localized Egyptian and Libyan rulers are bowing before him, thus showing their surrender to the Nubians. He also goes as far as to criticize the Egyptians for their mistreatment of their horses, saying that they are emaciated and that the Nubians will show them how to care for these horses. Pianki then made a drastic decision. He would allow these localized rulers to then return to their cities. They would not have much power, yet they were now in the employ of Pianki as his concessional supervisors. This included Shepenupet in Thebes. Placing this power on Shepenupet would ensure that when Amunirdis succeeded the position, the rule of Thebes would still be within the Nubian family, thus cementing their power even more. You see, unlike the Egyptian tradition that dictates that a male must be the heir or the ruler in power, the Nubians favored the maternal line of the family, and thus women often became rulers in Nubia. Shortly before the Nubian invasion, male priests in Thebes had been in control for quite a while of their religion. They had become more powerful than the pharaoh. A northern pharaoh made sure that his daughter would come to hold a high title in Thebes. She was a priestess, known as the god's wife. The title of the god's wife meant that you were spiritually married to Amun, a task that was generally appointed to the wife of a pharaoh in Egypt's new kingdom. This daughter, who was appointed god's wife of Amun in Thebes, was none other than Amunirdis' adoptive mother, Shepenupet. Holding the role of god's wife, she was to perform certain daily rituals to appease the gods. She was on the same level as the high priest of Amun. However, something was about to change all of that. She set about to change thousands of years of tradition. Shepenupet must have been a strong-willed woman, as she then garnered up enough support in Thebes to become more important than the male high priest. With Egypt being in its own chaos, Shepenupet then claimed Amun had appointed her the Lord of Upper and Lower Egypt, a bold claim that had never been heard of before. She is shown at Karnak and on many of her statues with these titles, as well as her own birth and new throne name in a cartouche. Shepenupet may not have really controlled the north, as her title claims, as we know other so-called pharaohs who also ruled. However, it was enough for her to maintain a female line of the rule in Thebes.
The adoption of a Nubian princess, Amunirdis, as God's wife of Amun, in many ways legitimized Nubian rule in Thebes. God's wife was a position that worked as a mediator between the king and God. It's also a position that held a lot of power, including controlling the economic resources at the temple of Amun in Thebes. Her adoption to become Shepenupet's successor would have been marked with a lavish ceremony. She would have been given properties and staff.
Adopting Amunirdis, the gift of Amun, was not only benefiting the Nubians' claims to the throne, but also Shepenupet. If she was seen as the mother of Amenirdis, it meant that Amun did truly choose her to rule Thebes, and of course, the god's wife was the earthly manifestation of the goddess Mut, the wife of Amun. On the back of a statue of Amenirdis, Shepenupet is listed as her mother given by the god.
Shepenupet does seem a little shy to fully throw her titles around.
She did build a temple in the domain of the male priests at Karnak. However, the small temple was built far away from the main temple. At the edge of Karnak, Shepenupet built this temple, usually closed to the public. Although small, the images make a large statement. Here Shepenupet shows herself as the god's wife, yet she is holding the flail, a kingly implement, as well as the double cobra on her brow, again a male symbol of kingship. The carvings are done in Egyptian style, yet they are Nubianized. In her temple, she also names Amunirdis as her successor. The close bond between the two, adoptive mother and daughter, can be appreciated. Shepenupet is breastfeeding the child Amunirdis. A very unique statue of the god of gods, Amun, can tell us about the status of Amunirdis. Sitting on the lap of Amun, being supported by him, is Amunirdis. No other woman, man, pharaoh, nor queen, apart from Amenhotep III, have ever been shown on the lap of Amun. This is so significant. It shows that Amunirdis has the closest relationship with Amun than anyone else. Although this faience statue is only a few centimeters tall, the glyphs are even more impressive.
The glyphs on the side of this statue read out Chemet Neter, Sa'at Neter, Meri Amun, Amunirdis, which translates to the god's wife, the beloved daughter of Amun, Amunirdis.
Right at the back of Karnak Temple, we can see Amunirdis here, receiving the key of life from Amun, as he hands her 3 keys of life, 3 lifetimes. The woman from Nubia, brought to Egypt and made into a god.
Amunirdis was being prepared to be one of the most important religious figures in all of Egyptian history. In this small temple, Shepenupet is shown alongside the pharaoh who succeeded Pianki, named Shebitko. He was the son of Pianki, making him Amunirdis' nephew. This pharaoh is shown in a noticeably different style to Egyptian pharaohs. Apart from different clothing, he also wears a uniquely Nubian cap crown, but this time with two cobras at his brow. This was a great symbol for the king of Egypt and Nubia to fully show he ruled two kingdoms. Around this time in 714 BC, Shepenupet dies. No tomb or mortuary temple for her has ever been found, yet she is shown in the temple of Amenirdis on the Theban West Bank, in the grounds of Medinet Habu in Luxor. In a side chamber, we can see that Amunirdis has now succeeded to the title of God's wife. She has an elaborate crowning ceremony, for now she was married to Amun, but also the ruler of Thebes. At the Cairo home of an early 20th century Irishman named Geir Anderson, amongst his vast curated collection of Egyptian artifacts, is a piece that shows Amenirdis at Karnak, joining with Amun.
In the Geir Anderson Museum is a beautiful plaque from Karnak Temple of Amunirdis being embraced by Amun. This is when she became the god's wife.
At Karnak, a giant alabaster statue of Amenirdis was installed. This sublime statue shows her virtually nude apart from a transparent skirt. She wears the feminine anklets. In her right hand, she holds the necklace of the goddess Hathor and wears a bracelet that contains her cartouches, protected by goddesses of Upper and Lower Egypt. She holds a swish in her left hand, reserved for the queen. Around her neck, she also wears an amulet of Amun. The back of the statue is filled with a long list of veneration texts to Amunirdis. But it is the crown that she wears that claims her position in Egypt and Nubia. Atop her head, she wears a round crown with protective cobras, usually associated with Amun's wife or queens. On her brow, she also has two cobras, and the main crown is topped off with the vulture crown of the wife of Amun, Mut, with the vulture's wings spread open across the sides of her head, a crown that was worn by one of the most notable Egyptian queens and a holder of the god's wife title from almost 600 years before, Nefertari. Amunirdis was associating herself with a long line of notable, powerful women in Egypt. Amunirdis then adopted her brother's daughter, who was named after Shepenupet. Shepenupet II was now in line to succeed Amunirdis. The deceased Shepenupet is shown leading the sacred bulls to the god of the afterlife, Osiris, and on the other wall, the lineage is clear. The late Shepenupet is shown on a platform, facing Amunirdis, with Shepenupet II behind, making offerings for the spirit of the former god's wife. Now, as god's wife and ruler of Thebes, Amunirdis would be tantamount to a pharaoh.
The role of the god's wife of Amun was very important in ancient Egypt, not only politically, in so much as she had lots of property, she had money, but she also was very important in the daily, like the taxing and the political decisions and these types of things. It was also very important role for her to have religiously and within the temples. Amenirdis would also have been trained in depth on some of the other rituals that were very important to the keeping of Ma'at throughout the land. One of these was a kind of an execration type of a ritual in which the serpent Apep, who was always after the sun god Ra, when he would ride in his boat through the hours of the night, he was always trying to take Ra out so that time would stop. And every morning Ra would somehow overcome him with the help of various gods and goddesses who were on the boat with him, and he would rise once again. And so there was a very special ritual called the overcoming or the overthrowing of Apep. And part of the ritual was that they would create these little wax figurines of the serpent Apep. And that was so that during the ritual, at various parts, that this serpent could be cut with a knife, this serpent could be spat upon, stomped upon, and even set on fire to keep away this element of chaos in the land of Egypt. And this is something that Amenirdis would have taken part in, is to make sure that Apep was completely taken out so that Ra could successfully make it through the hours of the night and rise once again in the morning. There was another very important aspect within this role of the god's wife of Amun. Sometimes the god's wives were also known as the god's hand. And this is in reference to something that we today might find a little embarrassing, but it was very much a part of just life and, matter of fact, something that happened in ancient Egypt that they didn't really blink an eye about. And this was the act of self-pleasure. And within this act of self-pleasure, obviously there needs to be the hand to do that. And so when the high priestess would shake the sistrum, it mimicked that motion of being the hand of the god, which is a role that the wife would perform. And then within this act, it brings to life all of these elements of creative abilities and gifts and potential that the god would have. So the playing of the sistrum also was a very important part of the practices that Amenirdis would do to keep everything going and flowing in the right direction. When we think about Amenirdis, I like to think about her as she would be waking up in the morning as the high priestess, knowing that she needed to get up, she needed to go to the sacred lake with the high priest and the high priestesses, other priestesses at the temple, purify themselves in the water. They would prepare all of the incense and they would prepare the food and get it all laid out and carrying it on trays and carrying their sistrum and wearing these beautiful clothes and all of their own jewels and makeup and entering into the hypostyle hall in the darkness, and someone would be walking and carrying the torch, and so seeing the light flickering on the temple walls, smelling all of the food and all of the incense and all of the fragrance from the essential oils, and hearing their footsteps. And outside someone would be walking out to that front portion of the temple to awaken that area with their songs and chants and hymns, and then someone would be waiting on the roof, and as soon as the sun god would come up, they would be singing and chanting and welcoming the god to the day. I like to think about Amenirdis in this way, as a woman, as someone who has a sense of devotion to the gods and goddesses. Yes, it was her duty, but I do feel that there was an element of belief inside of her, and this wanting to please the gods and goddesses in her role as the god's wife.
The new Nubian pharaoh Shibitko set his sights on expanding the empire further north. He made several trade deals with the Assyrian king Sargon. They appeared to have good relations, but news of Shibitko's ideas of conquests would lead to very fragile relationships between the two powers. In 705 BC, he possibly led a campaign against the Assyrians, which was unsuccessful and maybe even led to his death. The eldest brother of Amunirdis, named Shabaka, became pharaoh. With Amunirdis as God's wife and Shabaka as pharaoh, the Nubians were now able to take full control over all Egypt. Shabaka ruled over all the land. However, he allowed Amenirdis to retain her rule over Thebes. Amenirdis doesn't appear to be breastfeeding Shepenupet II. This is possibly because she was of an older age when she adopted her as successor. They do appear close though. Amenirdis' brother, the current pharaoh, Shabaka, did, however, reinstall the male high priest of Amun, a post that had been vacant for many years, as the god's wife was more elevated. He appointed his son as high priest of Amun at Karnak, yet he remained under the authority of Amenirdis, who ruled Thebes. This male high priest was Prince Horem Akhet. Today, we can see a unique statue of the Nubian man in Aswan.
This statue is of a Nubian high priest. His name is Horem Akhet. And Horem Akhet is actually the name of the Great Sphinx of Giza. So it's very interesting that he took the same name of Horem Akhet, the horizon of Horus. He's a high priest from Nubia, and he's the only person that we have shown with an ankh necklace around his neck. The only person in the whole of Egyptian statuary. He was shown unique.
His statue states, King Shabaka's beloved son, director of the palace of the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Horem Akhet, may he live for eternity. Pharaoh Shabaka did manage to defend Egypt from the Assyrian invasion, but this would cause major issues for the pharaoh who would succeed him. Amenirdis was training her niece, Shepenupet II, to take the role of God's wife. She was also overseeing the works done by High Priest Horem Akhet, as well as appointing an Egyptian nobleman as the new mayor of Thebes as a way to keep the native Egyptian population happy. His name was Montuemhat, and he would play a pivotal role in Egyptian politics, as he wanted the land back under Egyptian rule, as is evident from his lavish tomb at Asasif. In the year 700 BC, Amenirdis sadly died. Being the goddess Mut on earth, she was deified. Again, breaking from tradition, Amenirdis had commissioned a mortuary temple that also served as her tomb.
Upon her death, she would have been entombed at Ramesses III's temple instead of in the royal cemetery in Nubia. And like the god's wife before her, she would have been able to choose her own successor.
Her temple was built in the grounds of the temple of Ramses III at Medinet Habu. Her beautifully decorated temple is where her priests, priestesses, and followers could leave offerings for her spirit.
This is the temple for Amenirdis. You can see her repeated several times. Her name in a cartouche repeated over and over, Amunirdis. The god's wife, shown here, Amenirdis, as Mut repeated on either side.
Many scenes in the temple show Amenirdis on her journey to meeting Osiris. The temple inscriptions call this place the House of Eternity of Amenirdis. She is shown in both her spirit and soul form in the temple. She also shows her adoptive mother and her adopted daughter, helping her prepare for the journey to the next life.
Amenirdis' adoptive mother, Shepenupet. The high priestess pouring out water over her adopted daughter from Nubia, Amenirdis, cleansing her to become the god's wife, training her to be the ruler of Thebes in the 25th Nubian Dynasty.
Yet harking back to a tradition by the god's wife and pharaoh Hatshepsut, but embracing elements of Sobek Neferu, Amenirdis makes a bold statement. She shows herself dressed in male clothing, yet retaining her female body. This was to demonstrate that she was as powerful as an Egyptian king, yet at the same time she was a noble Nubian woman. On this same scene, she is accompanied by the god of wisdom, Thoth, and the leader of the dead, Anubis. They are leading her to her divine afterlife. The center of the temple would have housed a statue of her spirit, or Ka as they called it. This is where each day the next god's wife would come to give her thanks. But this house of eternity contains no burial chamber. The outside of the temple may provide clues. She was in fact buried under her temple. Her mummified body was placed in a subterranean chamber along with many of her beautiful grave goods. Today, Amenirdis' body and artifacts are housed at the Vatican. Her elaborate burial tells us that she was buried in Egyptian tradition. Her mummy was placed inside a set of nested wooden coffins, each in the stylized form of Amenirdis. It is clear that the burial equipment was made by the Egyptian craftsmen, as they have not strayed from their style and not depicted Amenirdis as a Nubian woman. Her exquisite outermost coffin shows Amenirdis wearing the vulture crown of Mut and is covered in scenes showing the resurrection of the god's wife to the next world. Her tomb contains several wooden statues of the gods, one of Osiris, Ptah-Sokar, two of the black jackal god Anubis, as well as the divine sisters Isis and Nephthys, who have their one hand raised and are mourning for the loss of Amenirdis. She, of course, had a box filled with figures of servants for the afterlife, and also her 4 alabaster canopic jars, which contained her mummified organs. Yet, the most precious item in the tomb was the body of Amenirdis herself.
I've been waiting so long to see her. This is Princess Amenirdis of the 25th Dynasty of Nubia, and she was adopted and moved to Thebes and became
a high priestess of Amun and Mut. So to see her, it's quite moving, actually.
Her body was covered in linen and then draped in a faience bead net dress, linking her to the goddess of love and beauty, Hathor. She has gold amulets placed on her body and a stone scarab to protect her heart. When Amunirdis' mummy was discovered, the wrappings were so beautifully done that they decided to only unwrap her face before covering her again. There exists only one photo of Amunirdis' face.
Her mummy reveals to us that she died probably around the age of 50, and we can see that she also had a few dental issues. Now, using this image of Amunirdis, we can attempt to reconstruct what the Nubian god's wife who ruled in Thebes could possibly have looked like.
With Amunirdis now gone, her adopted daughter, Shepenupet II, would become the next Nubian god's wife. In 690 BC, Pharaoh Shabaka also died. He was succeeded by the son of Pianki, named Taharka. Taharka is probably the most prolific of all the Nubian pharaohs in Egypt. During his reign, he donated much gold to Amun at Karnak temple.
This hallway in Karnak had these beautiful columns that were erected by a Nubian pharaoh named Taharka.
This expansion had to be approved by the god's wife, Shepenupet II. However, all that remains now of Taharka's monuments is this one giant pillar. Taharka had a daughter. He named her after Amenirdis. Amenirdis II was also adopted by Shepenupet II and named as the heiress to the god's wife title. Shepenupet II did not raise Amunirdis II in the same way Amenirdis I was raised by Shepenupet I. Rather, there was a wet nurse named Tashrepranet who would be the one who raises Amunirdis II. The nurse's tomb treasures can now be found in the Egyptian Museum in Florence, Italy.
Tashrepranet, the nanny of the daughter of Pharaoh Taharka. She looked after Amunirdis. And here we have the nanny's death mask. It's probably the biggest death mask I've ever seen. It is absolutely enormous. But think about, in the 25th Dynasty, when Princess Amunirdis was adopted, and this Egyptian woman looked after her. And for that, Taharka, who was ruling Egypt as a Nubian at that time, had her put into such an elaborate burial.
Tashrepranet was buried with a large wooden coffin which was housed inside an even larger wooden shrine. Taharqa had made alliances with the north. These alliances flared up the old issues between Assyria and Egypt from the reign of Shabaka. The Assyrians invaded Egypt, seeking to conquer. Taharqa and his army were successful in pushing them back out. This back and forth would go on for around 10 years, until 663 BC, when Taharqa's entire world would come crashing down. The Assyrian king invaded northern Egypt at Memphis in 671 BC. The Assyrians devastated the city and conquered it. The children and wives of Taharqa were all killed. The Assyrian king Esarhaddon wrote, "I have torn the root of Kush out of Egypt." Taharqa escaped back to Thebes. However, the Assyrians followed, and there, in 664 BC, Nubian pharaoh Taharqa was killed. In Berlin, at the Pergamon Museum, there stands the Assyrians' lasting reminder of their conquests against the Nubian pharaohs in Egypt.
This giant stela of King Esarhaddon of Assyria tells of him chasing Pharaoh Taharqa out of Egypt and back to his native country of Nubia. And this explains how the Assyrians have now recaptured Egypt. It's interesting, from this site, more than 20 other inscriptions were found venerating Ramses II from his battle of Kadesh when they signed the peace treaty. So it's really interesting how in one inscription they talk badly about the Egyptians and how they defeated them, and in the other they speak about how well they did. But in one way, was he really talking about Pharaoh Taharqa the Egyptian, or was he talking about Pharaoh Taharqa the Nubian?
This large stela shows the Assyrian king in a giant scale, and on their knees before him, tied up around the neck, wearing the cap crown with a cobra on the brow, is Pharaoh Taharqa, begging for mercy. At the Nubian Museum in Aswan are some of the final reminders of the great Nubian king, Pharaoh Taharqa.
These giant shabtis belonged to a great Nubian pharaoh who came into Egypt after his forefathers had taken Egypt back from invaders and brought the religion back up to its original standing. Shortly after, though, the Nubians were chased out of Egypt yet again. But these are some great examples of the funerary practices of Pharaoh Taharqa.
In Belgium, at the Art and History Museum, I've come to see a mummy of what could possibly be Taharqa's son.
This mummy is of a very, very young boy. He is from the 25th Dynasty, which means he's actually Nubian when the Nubians invaded Egypt and they ruled. So this little boy is most likely a Nubian prince. And we can tell he's royal from the arms that are crossed in the Osiris pose. That was generally reserved for royals. But also the quality of his burial. He's covered with very thick resin. He's got packing in his stomach to fill out the body. So when you are dried out, you don't, suck in. He's quite incredible to look at. And he's got this beautiful little anthropoid coffin. And it's got the Osiris beard with the curve on the end. There are no visible names because it's been varnished with some sort of resin, so we can't really see the names underneath. But this young boy, you could just imagine, he was a prince of a Nubian king.
The son of Shabaka, named Tantemani would become the next Nubian pharaoh. Although he began his reign down in Nubia, Tantemani made his advances back into Egypt to reclaim it from the Assyrians in 665 BC. The Assyrians had appointed an Egyptian man from Sais in the Delta as pharaoh, yet Tantemani was able to overthrow the new Egyptian pharaoh. Tantemani then marched on Memphis, where he fought against the Assyrians near the site of Abu Sir. The Nubians were defeated. Tantemani fled back to Kush. Yet, what was to happen all this time with Shepenupet II and Amunirdis II? What would their place be within Egypt? The last Egyptian kings in Sais during the Assyrian occupation had instigated a power agreement with Shepenupet II and the Egyptian nobleman, the mayor of Thebes, Montuemhat. Because the god's wife and her named successor were Nubian, the Egyptians now wanted them out of power. However, they could not kill the god's wife, nor her adopted daughter. This would be going against the will of the gods. So how would the Egyptians now take back power? They were already aided by the Assyrians to chase the Nubians out, and the Assyrians were happy to see a new pharaoh ruling over a reunified Egypt, thus ending the 25th Dynasty. The Nubian Dynasty. Their rule in Egypt was only less than 100 years. In 663 BC, the Saite Egyptian king Psamtik was named as Pharaoh of Egypt. Between Psamtik and Mayor Montuemhat, they compelled Amunirdis II to adopt Psamtik's daughter, Nitocris, as the heiress to the role of the god's wife. By doing this, they were using the religion as a way to gain back full Egyptian power over Thebes. Shepenupet II died in 650 BC. Amunirdis II became the next god's wife and would be training Nitocris to become her heir. Amunirdis II died in 640 BC. Nitocris became the next god's wife, securing full native Egyptian control back in Egypt. Only 2 more women would become gods' wives before the title was abolished. Shortly into the reign of Psamtik, the images of Nubian kings in Egypt would be erased, their temples torn down, and even the victory stela of Pianki over Egypt has the Nubian king's image removed. Egypt was claiming back its history, trying to forget about these few years of foreign occupation. Yet, we do have one last glimpse into the lives of Shepenupet II and Amunirdis II. At the burial sites of Asasif in Thebes, a man who was closest to 3 gods' wives reveals more. His name was Pabasa. He was the chief steward of Shepenupet II, Amunirdis II, and Nitocris, and worked for them well into the reign of Psamtik.
Here is the cartouche of Psamtik.
His unique tomb rarely demonstrates the mix of Egyptian and Nubian culture, as well as the politics at the time.
His tomb also shows us much of the funeral happening, as well as the offerings brought to him.
The funeral is happening here. You can see the 3 priests with their arms raised. They've got Pabasa's boat here, taking his mummy across. You can see probably his daughter, a son, and another son. They're all coming around. You can see they're bringing wool, and all of these men represent different cities, different regions in Egypt. And here is the man himself, Habasa, before what would be probably Piauki.
This first room is where the family would come to leave offerings to him. That is why it is so exquisitely decorated. And look at the beautiful little gazelle underneath. Habasa is here, standing behind this beautiful woman. This Nubian woman living here in Thebes. We know who she is. She's Shepenupet. There is her name above. She's offering 2 jars to Osiris, and she's leading Habasa towards Osiris, Shepenupet, the god's wife of Amun, the ruler of Thebes at this time. She's bringing this man into the afterlife before Osiris. She must have really liked him. Pillars in the first room show Habasa's journey to the afterlife. They show his barbird, his spirit, meeting with his mummy. Habasa also tells us about his life and shares some intimate scenes. Here's Habasa himself, and his beautiful pet dog underneath. This tomb is unique. It is unlike many other tombs. The scenes show everyday life as well as funeral scenes, harking back to the Old Kingdom, showing the renaissance that is about to happen within Egypt. From this point on, Egypt set out to restore its former glory. To think that the Nubian conquest was caused due to many circumstances. However, the catalyst of the invasion would start and end with 2 Nubian princesses, each named Amunirdis.